Salutations. Today's briefing: Australia in a Taiwan conflict. Expectations and realities. The Australian government believes the strategic environment has deteriorated. Australia is facing the most challenging and complex set of strategic circumstances we've seen since the Second World War, according to the Australian Minister for Defence. These statements are all about China, and the most likely near-term area of conflict with China will be over Taiwan. In such a conflict, were it to commit forces, Australia will need to, before the fact, achieve higher force readiness levels and, after the fact, have prepared for and be able to implement higher force sustainment levels. Of course, Australia won't be fighting China alone. Indeed, it will be a junior partner to the US. What will the US expect of Australia? And what will the Australian government expect of the Australian Defence Force, the ADF? Australia is not sleepwalking into war. A country can contribute to an allied effort not only by committing forces, but also by providing lethal aid or simply by publicly stating support and joining a sanctions regime. In any conflict with China, the US will aggressively seek the support of as many nations as possible. The US will want as many flags at the table as possible across all these areas. But before any of these steps are implemented, the US will be engaging with key allies to prepare a united and coordinated front. This will give those allies time to prepare. This scenario is set in 2027. Note, I have previously stated why 2024 is a danger year for conflict. See separate briefing link below. And some US officials believe conflict could break out as early as 2025. In this scenario, while tensions have slowly been increasing, recent developments have rapidly heightened tensions. China has announced that it will implement a quarantine of Taiwan. I use the word quarantine here as China will argue the case that this is a domestic matter, but this would in effect be a blockade. For Australia, a key element of preparation for a conflict with China over Taiwan will be in addressing its strategic oil reserve deficiency, as petroleum imports might be severely impacted during conflict. As a member of the International Energy Agency, the IEA, Australia is required to hold 90 days' worth of oil imports as emergency stocks. Latest figures from the IEA put Australia at only 59 days, the only country in the agreement not to satisfy the minimum 90-day holding. Now, this level of holding does fluctuate, but Australia is rarely close to achieving the required holdings. Some might add that in 2020, Australia reached an agreement to access part of the United States' strategic petroleum reserve to bolster domestic fuel security. That supposes the US will be prepared for Australia to access that oil in a time of crisis, and that this oil can be transported to Australia in a timely and safe manner. Additionally, prior to implementing sanctions against China as conflict approaches, Australia and others will try to anticipate actions China might take in response to these sanctions on China, and prepare its own economy as much as possible before joining a sanctions regime. Also, the ADF would need to ensure appropriate stocks of munitions and other critical supplies were stockpiled. In terms of logistics, let's call it war stocks. Maintaining appropriate levels of war stocks has never been a strong suit for Australia, and the conflict in Europe has only reinforced the significance of maintaining these stocks. Australia may not be able to rely on allies to be able to provide these stocks during conflict. Such that time would allow, key bases and facilities might need to be enhanced. This phase might also see the redeployment of certain ADF capabilities to the north of Australia. Flag 1. Economic and diplomatic support. As mentioned above, Australia will already know the US's strategy and preferred courses of action prior to implementation. Diplomatically, this will play out in the UN and any high-profile events where the US believes it can gain support for actions against China. Economically, this will be manifested in sanctions and/or embargoes on critical components that China relies on. Now, some nations might well publicly support the US diplomatically, but not economically. For example, witness Japan in terms of purchasing Russian oil despite the current oil sanctions and price cap. How robust a sanctions regime is Australia prepared to support against its major trading partner? Escalation of support. Flag 2, provision of military equipment. By 2027, both Taiwan and Australia are scheduled to have acquired the M142 HIMARS. Australia could show its support by providing its HIMARS to Taiwan. Also by 2027, Taiwan is scheduled to have the M1 Abrams in service, and Australia should have completed the upgrade and expansion of its M1 fleet. The M1 Abrams would provide another option for Australia in terms of the provision of military equipment to Taiwan. Note, any equipment Australia chooses to send to Taiwan would need to be delivered before a quarantine of Taiwan was implemented. Further escalation of support. Flag 3, commitment of forces. What options might the Australian Defence Force propose to government? Many are enamoured of nuclear-powered attack submarines, which Australia will eventually operate. But conventionally powered submarines, SSKs, can sometimes be the better option for certain missions. The Collins-class SSKs are good intelligence, surveillance and reconnaissance boats. Even though there are 6 in service, it is likely only 3 would be available for operations against China, meaning 1 continuously on operations, perhaps in the South China Sea. The Hobart class air warfare destroyers are very capable ships and train extensively with the US Navy. However, the Royal Australian Navy only has 3 in service, likely meaning only 1 is continually available for operations. The ANZAC class FFGs are capable supporting vessels for convoys or outer screen protection for a carrier strike group. 3 might be available at any one time for operations. The Royal Australian Navy also operates 2 capable underway replenishment ships, or AORs, that could provide crucial sustainment support to maintain ships at sea, reducing the need for them to return to port. The Royal Australian Air Force will also likely contribute significantly to Australia's force commitment to the conflict, not least of which would be the F-35A stealth strike fighters. By 2027, the RAF should have 3 operational squadrons, of which only 1 is likely to be committed to operations, and likely requiring air and ground crew augmentation from the other squadrons. The FA-18F strike aircraft might also be committed, but its range payload performance would require significant tanking assets, which would likely be needed elsewhere. The E-8-18G Growler electronic warfare aircraft will likely be in high demand for suppression of enemy air defence missions, but with only 12 in service, it is likely only around 4 would be continuously available for operations. The P-8 Poseidon maritime patrol aircraft is likely to be heavily committed, given the number and capabilities of the PLA Navy's SSK fleet, with perhaps 5 being available at any one time. Critical enabling capabilities that will likely be in high demand by the US will include the E-7 Wedgetail airborne early warning and control aircraft, but the ADF might only be able to allocate 2 on a continuing basis. Finally, airborne refuelling capability will be critical in this conflict. The RAF operates the KC-30 MRTT, which is very capable, but with perhaps only 3 continuously available, these assets are likely to be required solely for RAF and not able to support US aircraft. Also, the availability of these potential assets will reduce over time due to combat losses and maintenance issues. How many of these assets will Australia be prepared to provide? And what level of losses is Australia prepared to accept? Where might the ADF operate in such a conflict? Well, apart from bases on mainland China and Hainan Island, the PLA will likely make extensive use, while they can, of its facilities in the South China Sea, 3 of which have 10,000-foot runways. They also have ammunition and fuel storage maintenance facilities, and can have air defence and anti-ship missile systems. More broadly, the ADF will be operating anywhere along the First Island chain and around Guam. Missions will be both offensive and defensive, including defending critical infrastructure. Note, ADF assets will likely need to transit the Indonesian archipelago to reach operational areas. In summary, while no security treaty compels Australia to act, it is highly likely Australia will become involved in a US-China conflict over Taiwan. Militarily, while Australia will likely commit air and naval forces, it is unlikely to commit large conventional land forces. In terms of the theatre of operations, Australia will want to contain the conflict to Taiwan and environs, and not have it spread to the Indian Ocean or Southwest Pacific. While the ADF might deploy to Guam and Japan, and possibly even the Philippines, the role of the ADF's northern bases, together with long-range missiles, drones and intelligence support, will be crucial. Australia will likely provide vocal support for the US at the UN and participate in sanctions, and provide Taiwan with lethal military aid where possible. The US will expect Australia to fully support all diplomatic and economic measures against China, and to provide significant military capabilities for combat. The realities, however, may fall short of this. Australia is not sleepwalking into war. That concludes today's briefing. Thank you for watching. Happy to take suggestions for future briefings from subscribers, so please subscribe, like and share. Until next time, Vale de Cero.